Thank you both very much. If you're a regular viewer to The Late Show, you will probably have detected already a certain schizophrenia in the way that we cover contemporary art. On the one hand, there's Matthew Collings, our regular art reporter, forever interviewing obscure post-conceptual artists from foreign countries. On the other, there's Peter Fuller, editor of Modern Painters magazine, who crops up from time to denounce the avant-garde and defend what he sees as the traditional aesthetic values of art. Well, we decided it was time to get them face to face to slug out these contradictions once and for all. We invited each of them to choose 5 works of art by 5 living artists who represent what they consider to be the very best in contemporary art. The pieces are all here in the studio, including one kindly lent by the Tate Gallery. And Peter Fuller and Matthew Collings now have precisely 1 minute per work, the time limit will be set by a gong, to tell us why every one of these artists deserves to be better known. Then we let them loose on each other. See you in about 10 minutes.
First thing I'd like to say about this painting is that it's just a marvelous picture. It's beautiful to look at. Andrzej Jakowski, he actually painted it 2 years ago after the terrible storm that blew the trees down over Britain. He went out and saw all the fallen trees and thought he wanted to paint a large horizontal painting. But of course, he didn't just paint what he saw. He didn't actually see a big head or hand or anything like that, or the ground wasn't on fire when he went out there. What he used was his imagination to transform what he saw. And it's that quality of transforming imagination that I really like in a lot of paintings. The picture it's redolent with symbols. You feel them quivering everywhere. But actually, they're not the sort of symbols where you can say the head means that or the hand means this. They're all, the symbols are actually built into the way that the painting is painted. And although he's used these awful themes, he's managed to change them into something, I think, very delicate and beautiful.
This is a painting by the German artist Sigmar Polke, who's in his late 50s. It's fantastically influential artist within the art world, but very little known in England. And perhaps one of the reasons is that it clearly works in a very different way to the Jakowski that Peter's just been talking about, in that rather a sort of traditional single-point perspective space, which is rather simplified up and has a pleasant pixie-type person dreaming about some kind of hurricane or a storm. It's a radical, sophisticated, modern, abstract colour space. But beyond that, we don't really know what kind of tone of voice the painting's being presented to us in. Unlike the Jakowski, where it's very clearly signposted, oh, serious, dreamy, poetic art, we're not sure here if this is intense, emotional involvement on the part of the artist, the way that he's poured out this very acid colour with a very high, brilliant hue, or if it's just a kind of dance, or if it's just a very banal or lightweight doodle, or if it's very heroic on this scale.
Well, I think this is a truly spectacular painting. It's a painting by Arthur Boyd, who's an Australian, and I think one of the greatest artists working in the West today. His theme is almost always the same. It's the relationship of man, men and women, to nature, to the natural world that they inhabit. But it's not the sort of comfortable, cosy world of an English country garden. It's the Australian outback, and these are bathers in that outback, and they look rather like sort of broiled king prawns. They're clearly not at home in the world that Boyd has depicted them in. And yet it's not a painting that makes you feel despairing or depressed. I think it has its own kind of terrible, awesome beauty, which comes out of the sheer scale, the power of the thing. And I really feel that Arthur Boyd is an artist whose reputation ought to be much greater than it is. As far as I'm concerned, he's dealing with a thoroughly modern issue.
This is a painting by Simon Link, who's a much younger artist than Polke, and he's based in Britain. It's certainly dealing with a modern issue, but here it's the modern world, the art world. And he's looking at the the art world through the ads that appear in the American art magazine Art Forum, which is an incredibly rarefied journal of contemporary art. And he simply runs through the ads in various issues and reproduces them on a very large scale in oil paint, very lusciously rendered, so that all the decisions about shape and colour that painters are supposed to make spontaneously and intuitively are already given. And the focus of the painting seems to be somewhere else. We can't quite tell where. But it still functions very powerfully as a painting. It's a very beautiful surface, very nicely made, very evidently handmade when you come in and have a look at the brushstrokes. So it's saying something about the way that we expect certain things of art, and yet the more creative way to look at art is to do it without expecting things, to empty yourself of those pre-expectations.
Well, I chose this picture by John Bellany because I find it a very moving autobiographical painting. It's a picture he painted just after he had had a liver transplant, and it shows him, the artist, and this is his doctor, Roy Kahn, and this is his wife, and in the background we see his father. But it's a painting that almost celebrates his own recovery from what was a terrible experience. We see his own sickness, his ill health comes out even in the colours of the painting. And yet there's something else about it. There's something in the delicacy of the way that the paint is laid down, of the lightness of touch in the handling, which speaks of life. And that, again, is a quality that I like about painting. It's when it can deal with these terrible themes that bring us to the very edge of death, the end of experience, if you will, but do so in a way which is actually life-enhancing. Bellany's a Scottish painter, and I think he's one of the very best of the recent Scottish school.
Well, why the group Art and Language, who are now a duo, although there used to be many more of them back in the 60s and the 70s, why they're important is that perhaps they raise some of those issues and turn them into questions. You know, was Bellany really feeling that? Do those colours really communicate what Peter said? Or was Bellany just faking it? Was he just doing it for the money? Maybe we won't ever know. But what Art and Language do is that they present their own work and themselves as critics of their own work. So this is the 24th in a series of 25 paintings called Incident in a Museum. And it's Art and Language curating their own exhibition. In this case, an exhibition of dots on the walls in the Whitney Museum in New York, which is an impossible situation because the Whitney only allows American artists to be shown there, and Art and Language are a British-based group. Other puzzles are that the painting implies a kind of Renaissance perspective space that you could go into, but in fact, it's false and it's denied, and when you actually get in the middle of the painting, it's just repeated marks from the edge here. So it's...
Well, I must say I find the sort of paintings of art about art rather boring, and Maggie Hamlin's picture certainly isn't that. This picture, the Minotaur surprised while eating, it shows us the Minotaur devouring human flesh, and it is a picture which actually has the capacity still to shock us, despite the kind of all the advertising imagery, all the kind of things with which it has to contend. It is still a powerful, shocking image. The Minotaur is almost the opposite of the sort of Christ figure. The Minotaur is half man, half beast, instead of half man, half God. And I think Maggie Hamlin is trying to show us something about the bestiality of ourselves, if you will. But again, she doesn't just show us something that's horrific. It's like having Francis Bacon and Rothko in the same painting. You see all these horrible scenes here, but you have this beautiful, strange, almost ethereal background, and the two kind of clash and work against each other.
The paintings that I've been looking at all in some way raise the issue of the seductive appeal that painting has, partly by being themselves very seductive and very appealing and then giving that some kind of twist. But one couldn't say that about the work of the American sculptor Cady Noland, who's a completely new name on the scene, whose work doesn't seem to have any appeal. In fact, as we can see here, it's just a basket with some things in it. But in fact, they're quite significant things. There's a pipe, there's an American flag, there are a number of other bits like handcuffs attached to a police belt. And they come from an installation on show now in the West End, where a number of items from sort of decaying postmodern American society are distributed around the gallery, And we find out from looking at it that there really is a kind of aesthetic there, and a very clear one, and the coherence of the space really depends on developing an aesthetic, but finding it in these objects where you wouldn't normally expect to find any appeal at all. So we can say that really her work is about developing language.
Well, unlike the work that Matthew's just been showing us, which I must say means absolutely nothing to me at all, this little painting, a watercolour by William Tillier, is certainly seductively beautiful to look at. And I really don't mind that quality. I like it. Its attractiveness, its visual appeal is part of its strength to me. But I also think that it is quite a deep painting in its own way. What I like about it is the way that it combines that quality of freshness, the sort of fresh feeling that you get on a beautiful day on the moors in Yorkshire, which is what it shows. It combines that with a real sense of tradition. I mean, you can't really get more traditional than English landscape watercolour painting, and that's what this is. And yet in another way, you also can't get more modern. It is about the actual lived experience of the landscape. But it's not topographic. He's not showing us what it's like in any sort of detail. He's giving us the feeling of the place, the feeling of the mood that he had when he encountered it. A beautiful picture.
This is a work by Martin Kippenberger, who's another German artist, but a generation younger than Polke. And like Polke, Kippenberger looks for freshness, not in outmoded ideas of watercolour-y landscapes, but in ideas themselves, and in language and in communication, the possibilities of communication, and with that, of course, the possibilities of misunderstanding. So it's a key work for Kippenberger, not just that you have to enter it through a keyhole, but because it contains a number of symbolic objects, not the least of which is this brandy bottle designed by Salvador Dali as, for popular consumption, which Kippenberger has had cast in bronze. He's put a candle in it, and that illuminates a painting by Kippenberger, or kind of pseudo-Kippenberger, which is made out of wrapping tape, which rather than having fragile handle with care on it, has "I hold myself closed." And the painting is called "I'm Not Afraid, Why Are You?" And of course it refers to, in its stripes, to a radical painting by Barnett Newman, called "Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow and Blue?" For Barnett Newman, radicality was in 3 stripes, but of course Kippenberger is saying that in 1989 radicality is something quite different.
So there we have it, 10 artists, 2 completely different ways of looking at art. Is there any common ground here? Peter Fuller, is there anything in the Collingite view of art that you can relate to?
Well, to be quite honest, not a lot. I mean, I'm sort of bemused by some of Matthew's choices, but what I don't like, I suppose, about a lot of the things Matthew chose is this sort of standing back, quizzical, enigmatic, puzzled, and yet fundamentally empty and shallow approach. It just doesn't interest me. It doesn't get me where art really moves me.
Matthew?
I actually do enjoy Arthur Boyd very much. I think it's a really fantastic painting. But the types of art that Peter has chosen in the main are rather defenceless, vulnerable, sincere, in that I would say all of them are sincere, but they in a way make a display of their sincerity.
Do you mean they're about feeling rather than intellect? Because yours, in a sense, are more obviously intellectual choices.
Well, no, I don't think that's true. I think that I may have spoken about them in an intellectual way, but what I was going to say is that my works are much tougher rationally and conceptually and formally and in every way, and actually much better than anything I could say about them, whereas I think Peter's works are much more vulnerable and absorb sponge-like the things that Peter says about them.
Well, I think this is not quite the case. I mean, I do think that art, it actually can't be put into words, and there is a quality of vulnerability. There I would certainly agree with Matthew about all the best work. It actually resists being put into words. But you take something like that Katie Nolan basket full of bits and pieces over there. I mean, what is it? There is no vulnerability at all. There are just some things in a basket. Now, that sort of activity to me has no interest at all. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think great art makes great demands upon us. Now, I'm not claiming that everything I chose was in that sense great, but I think it does attempt to move us. It does attempt to make us feel something.
All right, well, how far is this a discussion then about style and content somewhere? If Nolan was to do something which was not about a commentary on American society, but it was about a personal feeling of grief or whatever, would you still be alienated from it because she would use those materials?
But I don't think there is a thing that's that's art, that is in any way interesting as art in that sense. I think there are good paintings and there are good sculptures, there are good plays, there are good books, but that is none of those things. What is it? It's a basket with some objects in, which is of no conceivable interest. It is not worthy of attention.
Matthew.
Well, it's quite true that it's quite hard to say what it is. The difference is, and that's perhaps, why I like it. She's a new artist, we don't know much about her. Maybe in the end it won't be any good, but we know for certain exactly what's going on in these paintings. That's why I say that Arthur Boyd's slightly different, because the sort of cheap special effects that all the other paintings very clearly calculate, like a kind of TV soap opera, are not there in the Arthur Boyd. It's much more sort of mad, perverse work. That's why, I quite like it. But in all of these works, it may be hard to say what they are, but we certainly know what they're not. They're not ingratiating, they're not unctuous, they're not appealing to familiar middle-class, boring, bourgeois taste for art, which isn't really inquiring about the world, which is only confirming our sort of stereotypical, banal ideas of what art is.
But to a certain extent, you're not necessarily questioning the world, you're questioning the art market. I mean, what all these share in common is that they are part ways commenting on the process of making art, aren't they?
Wait a minute.
Well, a number of them are.
Some of them are commenting on the art market, some of them are commenting on ways of making art, some of them are commenting on the way the world is full of banal and kitsch and mundane objects, but somehow you can be creative with those things and make a fantastic, beautiful, shimmering aesthetic experience, as the polka does, even though you're using ingredients which are banal. So there's lots of different things there. There are people looking at the art market and the art world, but also looking at the world.
You see, maybe this is my Philistinism showing, but your critique of the paintings of the works of art are very interesting indeed. I learn a lot from them, but I'm not sure I want to look at them having a kind of Matt Collins commentary on my Walkman the whole time. I'd quite like to be able to approach them without that. Whereas at least, however banal or bourgeois they may be, I can actually approach these without the commentary. In a sense, I don't mean to make you redundant, but I don't need you, Peter.
What do you mean by endorsing Matthew Collins' idea that good painting is bourgeois? I mean, it's the most ridiculous remark, and I strongly object to it. And I would also like to,
No, bad painting is bourgeois. These are the bad paintings.
But,
the Arthur Boyd isn't very bourgeois because it's quite a good painting.
But it's the idea, too, that a painting like the Joukowsky, which I find an extremely mysterious painting, is somehow self-evident. Then I would say that Matthew is just not looking.
It's mysteriously incompetent, the painting.
What Joukowsky says he likes to do is to use revelatory riddles, riddles that are never quite spelt out, but are in some sense touch upon areas of experience that are new to us, that they tell us something new, and they precisely cannot exactly be pinned down in words. And there is a point in confronting a picture like that where you just have to shut up and look. Whereas if you take something like that Richard Serra work by Link that Matthew showed us, I mean, there is nothing actually to look at all. There are some rather badly painted letters which are taken from an advertisement. There is nothing to look at or to hold our attention of any interest whatsoever. And that tiny little Tilia watercolour, reactionary, sentimental, whatever it may be, has to me 1,000 times greater aesthetic value than that Richard Serra advertisement.
All right, well, clearly you're not going to come together in the middle ground here. What astonishes me is how Stalinist you both are about these things. I mean, why can't we have a pluralist art world that allows both of these things to exist?
Well, because
why do you want them destroyed?
No, one doesn't want to destroy the other things. One wants to say that art has a kind of is a limited thing. It can't say something about everything, because if it does, it's too general, and that's what makes it boring.
Why shouldn't it be able to say something about
because
everything? Most other art forms can.
No, they don't. Iris Murdoch doesn't say something about everything in the whole world.
No, but
it's
other
limited
novelists
medium.
do.
No, I think you'll find that they may say something about the world, but they do it through the limitations of the medium. They acknowledge the limitations of the medium and what it can do. Art is visual art is a very problematic medium. These artists are about, looking at what art can do. It looks at the world in a certain way, and it looks at how art itself can look at the world. I don't think that you can't ask. One doesn't say, I want all these rather mediocre paintings to be destroyed. I just want to be straight about what they're doing. Right. Obviously, they're appealing to a certain taste. They're doing it in a very calculated way. The artists are rather boring people. They're not really interested in the world at all.
Are you claiming that all of them are fakes, that they didn't feel the things?
Who cares if they felt them or not? I mean, the problem here is that they're incoherent. These paintings, it might be hard to find out what's going on, but all we need to do is find out about them. We can see that something's going on. We need to investigate them and find out about them. We see in something like the Joukowsky, he's a sympathetic minor artist. It's a kind of mess of Chagall and Beckmann and bits of expressionism and poppy little brushstrokes here and there and a pixie. I mean, it really isn't saying anything, and it certainly isn't saying anything about everyday modern life.
Well, I think that what Matthew is saying is that, in fact, you can't put easily into words what a good painting...
But you can put
just
very
let me
easily into
finish,
words what that
please.
painting's doing.
That you cannot easily put into words what a good painting is doing. And that seems to me, you know, you were asking at the beginning about common ground. Well, there we have some possible edge of common ground. There are certain moments where Matthew seems to admit that aesthetic aspiration is of importance, and to me it is of supreme importance, that mere intellectual ideas, and let's scotch the idea that these are great intellectual ideas. Actually, they're trivial intellectual ideas, and reading any sort of article would give us better ones, or any book contains 1,000 times more. But mere intellectual ideas, whether good or bad, do not make great paintings.
All right, Matthew Collings, the last word, briefly, to you.
Well, the last word is that you don't find aesthetic experience by programming it in. You actually find it. You look for meaning in art, and aesthetic experience comes somehow. It's not something that you set out to find. Peter talks about it as if all these artists willfully didn't want any aesthetic experience. Of course, in the end, art is about both aesthetics and ideas and a range of other things.
God, that sounds dangerously near common ground. We'll end it there. Matthew Collings, Peter Fuller, thank you both very much. Good night.